Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Michael Brindley. I'm an assistant professor in the history department. I want to welcome you this afternoon to the second in a series of lectures under the rubric of Overcoming Bipolarity, New Approaches to the Cold War. This series is graciously supported by the program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Pierce and the Center for Collaborative History. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Jeremy Friedman, associate professor in the Business, Government, and International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School. Dr. Friedman received his PhD in history here at Princeton. Since then, he served as the associate director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy at Yale University before moving up to Cambridge, Mass. Dr. Friedman stands out as a preeminent scholar of international relations with expertise in the Cold War, Soviet, Russian history, and global history. In his work, he examines how the project of socialist revolution and leftist thought more broadly evolved over the course of the 20th century, particularly as revolutionary battlegrounds shifted from industrialized countries to the developing world in the wake of decolonization. He's the author of two pioneering works, 2015's Shadow Cold War, the Sino-Soviet Competition for the Third World, published by University of North Carolina Press, and 2022's Ripe for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World, from Harvard University Press. The second book draws on material from archives in 14 different countries and demonstrates reading proficiency in at least 8 languages. I think there's probably more. Both books contribute to an overarching project of writing the global history of socialism in a way that's responsive to new histories of capitalism. Dr. Friedman's scholarship extends beyond academia. His articles have featured in publications such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the Moscow Times, the Washington Post, and the National Interest, where he brings historical insights to bear on contemporary geopolitical challenges. Dr. Friedman has been awarded several distinguished fellowships, including the International Dissertation Research Fellowship from the Social Science Research Council, the George Washington University Mellon Predoctoral Fellowship, and the Eurasia Dissertation Completion Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy Friedman.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for inviting me. Everybody hear me? Is this off? Okay, I can just turn this one on. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. I was a grad student here a long time ago, and it's my first time back at Princeton to give a talk. At HBS, it is drilled into us from day one, you never ever read off a piece of paper in front of an audience. So I'm going to go with slides. I am not going to read in front of a piece of paper. So I'm going to present on, this is sort of an overarching talk that'll include a little bit of both of my books, as well as directions for my own future research and potentially others' future research in the Cold War. So first, I want to talk about what I think the big project is. I think the big project is the history of socialism. So I think many of us who study history are familiar with history of capitalism as a field. I've been reading job applications this week. I can tell you that definitely the majority of them, probably close to 3/4 of them, mention the word history of capitalism in the job application. I have not read the word history of socialism once in any of the job applications. And I think there are reasons for this, but I think it's problematic. So I think one of the reasons given for the lack of a field called history of socialism, we have, of course, Soviet history, Chinese history, Vietnamese history, Cuban history, and so on and so forth, but those are considered national histories. And there might be, Soviet foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy, Yugoslav foreign policy. But it hasn't really developed to the point where we have institutions, like we have in history of capitalism. We have, journal editions, we have conferences in history of capitalism. It's a sort of established field. And I think one of the objections is that people will still say real socialism has never been tried in practice, which is a perfectly legitimate political position, but it is not a historical position. So that would be like saying, real capitalism has never been tried. Capitalism is about efficient markets and perfect information and so on and so forth. And so real capitalism has never been tried. But the reality, of course, is that history of capitalism is precisely about the ways in which the practice of capitalism differs from the theory of capitalism, right? That in theory, capitalism is about, again, efficient markets, perfect information, and so on and so forth. In reality, capitalism involves coercion and racism and corruption and all these sorts of things. And that's what history of capitalism is largely about, right? The ways in which practice diverges from theory. Right, so socialism should be about the ways in which socialist practice diverges from theory, and as I will show in terms of my own work, it's not the way it diverges from theory, but the way it in turn shapes theory. Right, there's sort of an iterative relationship, a dialectical relationship, if one would like between theory and practice in socialism. And so the point is socialism, just like capitalism, evolves through the encounter of theory and practice. So the history of capitalism is very much about, for example, think about the transitions from kind of early 20th century laissez-faire to the social welfare state model, then towards neoliberalism. We have stories about these transformations, but the idea is that they respond to external stimuli, right? The external stimulus of World War II, the Great Depression, the challenge of communist revolution shifts capitalism to have to react to the social welfare model. And the same thing then happens in 1970s, right? There's however you want to describe it, the collapse of the dollar, perhaps. Maybe it's about, certain returns to investment in terms of industrialization. Something shifts that necessitates the kind of globalization, neoliberal shift in capitalism in the 1970s, right, which has been debated by many historians. But the point is, right, there's this iterative process between theory and practice. And so capitalism there evolves, and it evolves on a global scale, right? It doesn't evolve within one country. So Japanese capitalism might not look like American capitalism, but there's a way in which they relate to one another. So I think socialism, history has to look in some sort of similar way, that Soviet capitalism does not evolve in the abstract, does not evolve in a vacuum, but involves in relation to Yugoslav capitalism, socialism, Hungarian socialism, Chinese socialism, so on and so forth, and non-Marxist, non-communist versions of socialism, as I will discuss. So I study the third world, the quote-unquote third world, in large part because during the Cold War, that is really the most interesting laboratory for socialist development. That is where essentially you can run experiments. So I've done this in 2 books so far. And the reason I look at the global south, the third world, is because by the 1950s, 1960s, right, the first world, the workers are seen as no longer being revolutionary. Right? Essentially, the social welfare state has succeeded in making them conscious of being tied to the status quo. Right? Unions are pushing for higher wages, but they're no longer seen as likely to overthrow the entire system. And there's a realization of this in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, that the working class in the West is not likely to be revolutionary the way they had imagined they would be in the 20s and 30s. In the second world, the communist world, growth is slowing down, social planning models proving inefficient, but whereas many have explored in terms of Jaakko Fagan, other people looking at Gromyko reforms and on, right, the bureaucratic inhibitions to economic reform prevented the kind of experimentation that some people did want to see inside the second world, but didn't actually come to pass, right? To a certain degree, in Yugoslavia they did, goulash communism in Hungary, but not on this kind of scale that could have existed, right, elsewhere. So it's in the third world that conditions are not right for socialism as Marx himself envisioned, but where you have the opportunity to have, politically dynamic systems that are more open to new formulations. But in order to do this, right, as I said, Marx did not envision socialism in a place where you don't have, right, where it's not one of the leading industrial states. And so there are key questions for how one would develop a model for socialism in the third world. And these are some of the key questions. So first of all, what kind of political system makes sense for introducing socialism, right? Democracy or authoritarianism? How do you build socialism in an agrarian economy? Of course, Marx envisioned that capitalism develops the means of production and the state then seizes the means of production once they've been developed. But if you don't have those, you don't have factories, you don't have workers, right? How do you develop socialism from an agrarian economy? And then what is the role of the state versus the private sector in that economic development, right? Can the state essentially fulfill the functions that private capital was supposed to do in terms of developing the means of production? How should racial, ethnic, national divisions play into socialist politics, right? So socialism is predicated on the idea that the primary cleavage in society is class struggle, is class differentiation. But many people in the developing world see their struggles in terms of primarily race, ethnicity, religion, perhaps gender, right? These are the defining characteristics. You ask people in Africa in the 1960s, right, what defines, right, your oppressor? And they're unlikely to say that they're bourgeois. They're more likely to say that they're white, European, Christian, perhaps. And so how do you deal with those sorts of cleavages in socialist politics? And then, of course, religion itself. Religion is not just an identity, but it's also an institution, right? There are places which religion has institutional power. So how do you deal with religion as an institution in terms of, should it be combated because Marxism sees religion as the opiate of the people, the opiate of the masses? Or do you find a way to accommodate it? So in this, one question is the role of ideology, right? I mean, I take ideology very, very seriously. I think there's been a debate, I'll get in my talk at the end, about historiography and Sergei Radchenko, who's made a point of opposing the importance of ideology and sort of focusing on maybe not quite realpolitik, but a version of realpolitik. I think ideology matters, but I think ideology has been misunderstood. And I think that's part of the reason why I think people have failed to see the proper role of ideology in this sort of policy. It's because, especially in political scientists, tend to use ideology as a set of axioms against which you test policy, right? It's predictive, right? If you believe in ideology A, then that would mean that you should produce policies B, C, and D. And if you don't produce policies B, C, and D, then you don't believe in ideology A. And to me, that's the wrong way to look at ideology. So I define ideology in my book as a systematically simplified way of understanding reality that facilitates judgment and action. Right? What ideology is it's essentially a prism. It's a way of reality by itself is far too complex to understand at first glance. You have to have something that tells you, okay, which are the parts of this reality that are the most salient, right? What are the causes? What are the effects? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? What is the story I derive from this? And then once I know what the story is, then I have to decide, okay, what do I want to do about it, right? So it doesn't predetermine your policies, but it sets up the narrative that will then inform your policies. So that's how I think ideology fits in. It does not predetermine conclusions, right? How the ideology is translated into policy depends on beliefs, capabilities, and interests. So for example, right, if you believe that you can defeat the United States in a war, that might lead to different policy conclusions than if you believe the United States is hostile, but it's impossible to defeat it in a military conflict. So that is one kind of salient distinction between, let's say, how the Soviets, the Chinese might have viewed the United States in the 1960s. The Soviets didn't think war was possible. The Chinese thought that there was a way to win sort of a global guerrilla war against the United States. Capabilities, of course, right? Can you, yes, you might like to support revolution in country X. Can you actually move enough troops to country X to make that possible, right? So your policy is whether or not you say support revolution in the Congo is not just about whether you believe in revolution in the Congo, but whether you actually have military facility to do so, and your interests, right? There are interests in terms of what you think your country needs for its own self-defense or its own economy that might impede upon the policy conclusions that you draw from the ideological narrative. But ideology is what's shaping, I think, the process of policymaking behind the scenes here. So in my first book, I look at the way that different ideologies between the Soviets and the Chinese translated to answers to those questions that I showed on the previous slide, right? So if you're trying to develop a model that fits the conditions of the developing world, your, again, beliefs, capabilities, and interests will shape the ideological answers that you come to. So the Soviet focus was on anti-capitalism. They wanted, first and foremost, to eliminate the capitalist economic system. That was their focus. That meant peaceful existence with the West. We do not want to fight a world war. And they thought that any potential military conflict in the third world could lead to world war, could escalate. And so they did not want to encourage guerrilla warfare. Emphasis on heavy industry, the idea being that first you build the commanding heights of the economy for two reasons. Number one, because it's easier to do this with state-led development. So these are things like mining, metallurgy, railroads, really a heavy focus on infrastructure and geology, to some degree textiles, but usually secondary. Those are sort of the heavy industry, right? It's state-led development, number one. And number two, that also means you develop the largest working class possible. And a working class, as we'll see, is necessary for having a communist party. State ownership, and allow foreign investment if it develops industry. So they are willing to allow foreign capitalists in if they contribute to the project of building an industrial economy which will lead to a working class and a communist party. The Chinese recipe that they gave developing countries in the 1960s is very, very different. So for them, the focus is anti-imperialism. It's getting the former colony as far away from the political control of the metropole as possible. It's not about defeating capitalism there, it's about defeating imperialism there. So first of all, they promoted armed struggle, right? In Algeria, for example, in Cuba, in the Congo, in Angola, in many places, in Vietnam. Emphasis on light industry and agriculture and private trade. This is because the Chinese idea is that in order to essentially reduce the role of the imperialist power, you have to build the political legitimacy of the new post-colonial government. And one way to do that is to build up living standards. Right? If people are living better now than they were under colonialism, they support the post-colonial government. And so small-scale trade and consumer goods, food processing, small-scale textiles, right? Those are the kind of things that the Chinese are promoting in the 1960s as a way of raising living standards. But the key is to eliminate Western economic influence. So it doesn't matter if the Westerners are investing in heavy industry and building working class, right? Any foreign capital is an element of foreign influence that you do not want to exist anymore. And so these are ways in which you get, through different sort of ideological prisms, you get different answers, different models, right, of what socialism should look like in the developing world. And they're very serious about this. So there are certain scholars who think that the ideological patina, or as they would call it, right, that is a facade, really, for Soviet and Chinese aid in the developing world, that this is really about economic exploitation. If this was true, the Soviets would have been the worst business people in the world, right? Because they never made money off any of these things. And they weren't really designed to make that much money. First of all, there were low interest rates. Second of all, they didn't maintain equity in their aid projects. But I think it's very hard to make the argument, right, that ideology was not the focus of Soviet foreign aid projects. So I think this was not about profit. And you can see from the projects that still exist. So this is the largest Soviet aid project in the developing world during the Cold War. This is the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. This still exists there. This is when it was the United Arab Republic. You can still see their school children who come to visit it. And this is the largest Chinese aid project in the developing world. Again, neither of these produced any profit. Major expenditures, neither produced any profit for their host, providing government. This is the Tazar Railway. This is the Dar es Salaam terminal. This was supposed to connect the copper belt in Zambia with the Indian Ocean. This was a way of exporting copper from Zambia without having to use Rhodesia, which after declared independence in 1965, UDI, right, under white rule, they wanted to avoid. This took the Chinese 6 years to build after the US, the World Bank, and others said it was uneconomical. I took the train. When I went there, it did not make it as far as the Zambian border, but I think it's actually now reverted to Chinese management. So I don't know whether it goes all the way now. And the important thing to point out, right, is that this history of socialism, right, this conversation about building socialism in the developing world, is not just kind of superpower to client state or metropole to periphery. This is also a lateral conversation. And that's part of why I think the history of socialism is so important, because it is, by virtue of the fact that it's an ideological discussion, one in which people can have standing, even though they don't have political economic influence commensurate with the bigger powers. And that is not to say that there were not gradients of power, gradients of influence. Of course, the Soviets matter a whole lot more in this conversation, but they're not the only ones that matter. And so there are lateral conversations happening. This is a Tanzanian nationalist newspaper from 1972, and their interpretation of what's happening with Salvador Allende in Chile, which they entitle Our Ujamaa in Chile. Ujamaa is the Swahili word meaning togetherness, familyhood, which was used for the socialist program in Tanzania. And this is them interpreting what Allende is doing in Chile as a version of what they're doing in Tanzania. And the Tanzanians were very conscious, as I'll talk later, about the influence that their model was having around the world. It's not just a question of accepting or rejecting Soviet or Chinese models. So now I want to talk about the trajectories, right? So as I said, there are models, right, sort of that were formed to try to answer these questions about how you build socialism in the developing world. But the point is, it's an iterative process. So the models change over time, right? So you try one way here, it doesn't work, you try something else somewhere else. And this leads to an evolution. So by the end of the Cold War, right, the visions or projects of socialism are not the same as they were when the Cold War began, because you've iterated, right? The same way that capitalism iterates, and capitalism in the 1990s doesn't look like capitalism in the 1950s anymore. Neither does socialism. So I want to look at one trajectory of economic models and how it changes. So in the beginning, the Soviets were very focused on, as I said, supporting state-led heavy industry. This is a message from the Soviet embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia, 1958. And the key here is that they're trying to encourage the Indonesians to develop their tin industry. And the key here is that, right, it will be preferable not to wait for a proposal from the Indonesian government and put forth their own initiative on this issue, right? This is not a response to an Indonesian request for aid. This is a Soviet initiative that we think it would be good for the Indonesians to develop a state-led tin industry, and we should propose it to them. So I go into great detail in my book about how the Soviets were actually focused on shaping Indonesian industry in a state-led way as a way of creating the kind of economy that they thought would lead Indonesia to socialism. So it's the Soviets sort of looking at, how do we create the kind of economy that will produce, again, a working class and therefore a communist party. So it's the idea that economics will shape politics, and this is how you shape by building a state-led industry. And of course, this would be very expensive. If you do this all around the developing world, right, this involves a lot of economic aid. This is Yuri Bochkarov spelling out some of the logic. This is writing about Guinea, where the Soviets did something similar in early 1960, of course, on a smaller scale because it's a much smaller country. But he argues in Guinea, right, that yes, there will be differentiation. right? If we develop state-led industry, this will lead to differentiation of classes, right? There will be a working class. There will be, perhaps some sort of, bourgeoisie, but tied to the state, right? And this is not undesirable, right? This industrialization will lead to the growth of the working class. In these circumstances, new social trends and even organizations may quite possibly arise. So the theory is, right, that if you change the economic structure, you change the social structure and the political structure. But change the economics first, right? Industrialize first, state-led development, and this way you create, right, a balance of power between the classes. You have a working class that now becomes more and more numerous. You don't really have a capitalist class because you have state-led development. And so eventually, the working class forms a communist party and takes power, right? That's how this kind of development is supposed to lead to revolution. The problem is, right, that the people in power, i.e., for example, the president of Guinea, figures out what's happening, decides the Soviets are trying to overthrow his government, which is not totally wrong, and expels the Soviet ambassador about 2 years later. And a similar thing happens in Mali. And the Soviets begin to understand that this policy has a couple disadvantages. One, it's very, very expensive for them to build industry throughout the developing world on their own aid. And number two is that it creates political hostility because the leaders eventually figure out that you're trying to overthrow them, right? In the long run, but nevertheless, right, that they're becoming obsolete in your mind. So that doesn't work, right? This is seen as a model that it's tried and failed. Okay, try something else. So Julius Nyerere comes along in Tanzania, president of Tanzania from 1961. And Nyerere initially does not look like a very good candidate for Soviet aid. So first of all, he's educated in the UK. He's sort of a Fabian socialist, not really a Marxist. The Chinese don't like him either because he wants to run what he considers a post-racial regime or a non-racial regime in which whites and Indians have a role in politics, which the Chinese consider to be sort of making him a stooge of imperialism. And so there are many good reasons why, right, especially considering the loyalty of the Soviets, or the value the Soviets place on loyalty to Marxist theory, so for the Soviets not to be sympathetic to Nyerere when he decides to become socialist or decides to promote a socialist project. But this is exactly the point, right? They are open to different ways of promoting socialism. So contrary to the ideas people might have about the Soviets promoting sort of a Stalinist orthodoxy around the world, they're actually open to different versions of socialism that didn't even originate in Moscow, right? Let alone with Marx and Lenin. So Nyerere introduces the Arusha Declaration in 1967. There is real socialism in it, as he says, right? To build and maintain socialism, it's essential that means of production are controlled and owned by the peasants, the machinery of their government. So state ownership, and the ruling party should be a party of peasants and workers, right? So in that sense, it is socialist, but it differs from the previous versions of socialism in two ways. Number one is that he does not envision building industry first. This is agriculture first. And you develop an agricultural surplus and sort of bootstrap your way up. Agricultural surplus, get foreign currency, use that to develop. But he's even worried about, he doesn't want to urbanize too fast. He's afraid of cities exploiting the peasantry. So it's agriculture based. And number two is he doesn't want foreign aid, right? He doesn't want foreign capital involved because he thinks that creates dependence. Any foreign aid will compromise Tanzania's independence. So it's a different model from the previous model, right? It's not industry-led and it's not based on foreign investment. And the Soviets are willing to think, say, well, let's see if this works, right? What we try to do in Guinea, in Mali, in Ghana, in Indonesia didn't work. Let's see if this works, what Nyerere is doing in Tanzania. And there's actual differences of opinion here. So you can see a Soviet expert in Tanzania is quite skeptical, right? Saying that neither the theoretical prerequisites nor certain practical experiences, right, create an immediate possibility of effective social reconstruction. He thinks this is not going to work. But an expert in the Soviet foreign ministry says that this does have a progressive character, directly the creation of the prerequisites for the development of a country along the non-capitalist path. He thinks this is a productive step along the non-capitalist path. So again, if this were a country that was either using ideology simply as a facade for economic gain, or, right, if it were a country that was simply trying to impose an orthodox economic model, right, you would be hard-pressed to see this kind of debate as to the progressive nature of a non-Marxist version of socialism in Africa. But that's exactly what we see. And of course, the Soviets had other reasons to be suspicious of this because Nyerere is much closer to the Chinese than he is to the Soviets. He visits China in 65 and 68 before he ever steps foot in Moscow. So given the hostility between the Soviets and the Chinese at this time, right, he's also not a client of Moscow, right? He's not even geopolitically loyal to them. And yet, right, they want to see how this project succeeds. This is Julius Nyerere visiting Mao in China in 68. And again, the Tanzanians are very conscious of the fact that they are producing their own model, which might serve as a precedent. So this is, again, Tanzanian nationalist from 1972. Are we deviating or setting a precedent, right? Tanzania can openly ask itself, are we the ones setting a precedent in terms of social development for the entire developing world? You remember Ujamaa in Chile? This is a great article I saw, What Can We Learn from Hungarian Agriculture? This is actually worthy of Arthur Miller in The Crucible, because the entire thing is really sort of a veiled criticism of Tanzanian government policy about pretending it's all criticizing the Hungarians. But again, this is about lateral conversations. So this is a conversation that is happening, again, between Moscow and Beijing and poorer countries, but also laterally between Tanzania, Chile, Hungary, and others. Of course, what happens at the end is this model fails as well. So it ends up in forced villagization. It was supposed to be voluntary. I get into this in much greater detail in the book as to why it ends up in forced villagization. But the bottom line is no industry, no foreign aid, no technology, right? Unproductive communal farms. And so they don't manage to produce the kind of surplus they would need. And then the oil embargo hits, oil prices rise, Tanzania is an oil importer, and the terms of trade deteriorate, and Tanzania goes deep into debt just to be able to fuel its own economy, and this experiment collapses. And the Soviet verdict in this, right, as Alexei Kiva writes in October 1974, is that this was a mistake, because it all should have been voluntary, it all should have been slower, and so they blame villagization and the coercion for the failure of Ujamaa. So the Soviets decide this model also doesn't work, right? Our first model didn't work, this model doesn't work, right? So foreign aid, developing industry doesn't work, bootstrapping from agriculture doesn't work. What's option number 3? So option number 3 they try in the People's Republic of Angola, which becomes independent in 1975. And the Angolans say, we're not looking to build African socialism. There's only one kind of socialism, right? The real thing, Marx's Lenin socialism. So Nascimento, right, this is what he says about real socialism, because African, Asian, American, Spanish socialism doesn't exist. He also says that he wants Angola to be the first socialist country in Africa, the way Cuba is the first socialist country in Latin America, right? That's what Nopo Nascimento envisions. And right, this is Fidel Castro, famously, the Cubans send initially about 35,000 soldiers, many of them on Soviet planes through Guinea, across the Atlantic into Angola. Eventually, almost 500,000 Cubans serve in the Angolan Civil War, which is incredible for a country of about 10 million people. And you can see the banner says, right, o que é determinante para a unidade é a ideologia não a geografia, right? What is determining for unity is ideology and not geography, right? The supremacy of Marx-Leninist ideology, socialist ideology, right, over African socialism, Latin American socialism, geographical particularity. And how does this socialism actually work in practice? So the Soviets advised the Angolans, right, we don't want to be paying for you to have state-led industry, and we don't think you can bootstrap on your own, so where's the capital going to come from? If it's not going to come from us, and it's not going to come from your own exports, it's going to come from the capitalists, right, from the West, private companies. And the key is they will develop your resources for you, but as long as you control the politics, right, you can use their capital to help you develop your political system. And so the Angolan Civil War ends up in this sort of preposterous situation in which Gulf Oil, right, the American company, is developing Angolan oil resources, exporting oil from Angola, giving the proceeds to the MPLA, who are using it to fight the war against American-armed United guerrillas, and there are Cuban troops protecting Gulf oil installations from the American-armed guerrillas. Right? That's where this ends up in Angola. And so you end up with utilizing foreign capital, foreign direct investment, and markets as a tool of building socialism. And the key to this, how does this work? Because you maintain control of the politics. So as we'll see, right, you've reversed the relationship between politics and economics. So this is the Soviet embassy in Mozambique, right, going through a similar process. And it's worth looking at this carefully. Right? These transformations, they're talking about democratic transformations in the Soviet terminology, which means mass entry into politics. It means increasing living standards. It means sometimes land reform, which are necessary intermediate stage transformation of socialism, together with the not yet profoundly affected private capitalist bases of ownership. Right? So this is not, they're not starting with collectivization of agriculture. They're not starting with state ownership. They're starting with continuing private bases of ownership, therefore open certain possibilities for the spontaneous development of the capitalist tendencies of the economy, and could enable the dispersal and strengthening of bourgeois ideals and social consciousness. Right? So the danger here is that if we try to develop an economy through private capitalist means, then you might develop a capitalist class, which might develop its own political interests and political parties. And then, of course, you've lost control of the country if you have capitalist control of not just economics, but the politics. So it is precisely because of this that Frelimo, the ruling party, today devotes so much attention to the specific principles and conceptions of political and ideological leadership, right? You have to have a Marxist-Leninist ruling party focusing on political and ideological control, and that's how you prevent, right, the private capital in the economy from becoming politically dominant. So that's the new model here, right, by the end of the Cold War, right? You've gone from, we're going to build the economy first, right, create a working class, we'll develop the politics, to we're going to use private capital, but have socialists control the politics, and that's how we'll ensure social transition, right? You're going from the primacy of economics to the primacy of politics. And so let's talk about political models, right, and how the political strategy evolves over the course of the Cold War. So one of the early experiments in the developing world is in Indonesia. Indonesia has the biggest non-ruling communist party. According to some estimates, almost a quarter of the population, 25 million people by 1965, are in some communist or communist-affiliated organization. And so they're a major element of the ruling regime. And it seems like, right, Indonesia could be a possible place in which communists can come to power democratically. They won a quarter of the vote in the 1955 parliamentary elections, and there's potentially a route for communists to become a political power in the country. And yet, when Sukarno, the sort of radical anti-imperialist post-colonial leader in Indonesia, decides to implement what he calls guided democracy, right? The communists have a choice to make. Do we endorse guided democracy? Do we go along with the idea of essentially a functional dictatorship, in the belief that we're in this kind of logjam with reactionary parties, Islamic parties, capitalist parties, bourgeois parties that we can't really break, and this sort of we can jump over this, right, by allying ourselves with a demagogue who says he wants to bring socialism to Indonesia, right? Or do we maintain our own control and democracy and hope we win out the parliamentary system? So the Soviets, the Indonesian Communist Party, is undecided about how to react to Sukarno's pronouncement of guided democracy. It's the Soviets who seem to push them over the edge and say, go with the socialist or the leader who's claiming to be socialist. And so essentially they endorse the end of democracy. They think authoritarianism is perhaps a shortcut to socialism in the developing world because it breaks through the logjam of democratic politics, at least as it played out in Indonesian parliament in the late 1950s. And then what happens, of course, in Indonesia in 1965 is there's an attempted coup, there's a counter coup, the Communist Party is massacred. And one of the things the Soviets take away from this is that it was a mistake to tie the Communist Party's fate to Sukarno. They should have maintained democracy. It's ended in disaster. And so they decide, let's give democracy another chance, just in time for Salvador Allende to be elected as president of Chile. And so this is Brezhnev in a party plenum in March of 1971. So this is before, he's talking about the foreign policy part of his speech, the upcoming party congress, talking about the victory of Allende and Unidad Popular in Chile. For obvious reasons at the Congress, this will be talked about rather guardedly. He won't say this in public for the world. But here in our auditorium, it is possible to add that the coming to power of communists and socialists through the constitutional path, if of course they manage to hold on to power and realize their declared program in substance program for building socialism, it will have immense principal significance, considers the influence the further development of many Latin American countries. He's saying, let's see how this plays out, right? If this works, if socialists and communists come to power democratically, this could be an effective way for communists to come to power in the rest of Latin America. There are other places where they talk perhaps about even Latin Europe, France and Italy. Something like this will sort of eventually happen, not democratically, but there'll be communists in power in Portugal for seemingly close to power in 74 and 75. So they go from let's use autocracy as a shortcut to socialism. That failed in Indonesia. Let's see how democracy works. And maybe if it works in Chile, it will become a symbol for the rest of Latin America and possibly elsewhere. And the Soviets encourage the Chilean Communist Party to follow this policy of supporting democracy. So I've gone through the archives in Moscow. There are thousands of pages of conversations between the Soviet ambassador and Chilean politicians in these years that are available. 70, 71, 72, 73. The Soviet ambassador is meeting with the head of the Communist Party, the head of the Socialist Party, Allende, almost on a weekly basis. He's coaching every single one of them on their politics. It's really a very intensive level of political advising. And yet, right, there's a division within the coalition, right, with two main parties, the socialists and the communists under Allende. And Allende is nominally a socialist, but he's actually politically closer to the communists. And one of the main differences is that the socialists, they don't really want to continue with democracy. They think democracy is a dead end. We came to power democratically, but now we have to seize power and not hand it back. We can't continue with elections. We have to sort of maintain control of the country. Well, the communists think, look, we won an election with 36% of the vote. We have to find a way to get a majority on our side and build support for socialism organically so that we win majorities in future elections. And so the coalition is dividing. They have this big conference in El Arayan in 1972, and they produce two different sets of priorities here, two different sets of policies. So one is how much land you should nationalize. This looks like perhaps a minor detail, but it's actually incredibly significant for the following reason. How big a piece of land do you nationalize is about how many stages you think the revolution has. That's what they're actually arguing about. If you think that the revolution only has one stage, right, then we're not trying to get the bourgeoisie, the middle class, anything on our side. We're just trying to mobilize the proletariat, the poor peasants, and get ready for confrontation. So if you nationalize everything over 40 hectares, right, you're alienating not just the upper classes, the big landholders, but the middle classes too. And you're saying, we're going to create the largest possible group of people to fight for us when the confrontation comes. The communists are saying only 80 hectares. Let's bring the middle classes to our side, right, and isolate only the rich. And this is a way of getting an electoral majority, right? Not a fighting group, but an electoral majority. So that's why you nationalize 40 versus 80. The socialists want to negotiate with the Mir, right, the far left, the leftist revolutionary movement, not negotiate with the Christian Democrats, who are sort of the centrist party, who are really the key, right? If you ally with the centrist party, the Christian Democrats, then you actually can have potentially an electoral majority. The communists want to condemn the left wing, those who are outside the electoral system and are fighting guerrilla war. Reach understanding with the Christian Democrats. The socialists want to have immediately sort of upend the Constitution, establish a unicameral legislature, revamp the Constitution, and the communists want to leave the Constitution intact and win the election in 1976. Right? This is a program geared towards winning people's votes over, right? Getting the middle class on your side, the middle classes, the Christian Democrats, and the key here, right, is the Soviets are advising the Communist Party, right? So the Communist Party program is what Moscow was advising, and East Berlin, by the way, who's also heavily involved here. They're promoting, right, the maintenance of democracy as a way, like communism, socialism should come to power through gaining electoral majorities here. And of course, what happens in Chile is that explodes too, right? So Allende never really manages to convince his coalition to follow one direction, and ultimately the military decides to overthrow the government. And you end up with Pinochet for 17 years. And so that looks like a failure as well. And the question now is, okay, well, if the autocratic road to socialism failed and the democratic road to socialism failed, right, what lessons can we take away from this? So when Iran has a revolution in 1979, believe it or not, they're applying, this is Boris Ponomariov, the head of your national department, who's applying the lessons of Chile. He's saying, well, gee, what happened in Chile was that the remnants of the old regime and the military allied with the Americans to overthrow the revolution, to overthrow Allende. So these are the people we can't trust. We can't trust, right, the middle class. We can't trust the military. We have to maintain loyalty behind the leader of the revolution, the most anti-American leader of the revolution. And so he decides to support Khomeini. Right? There is a transitional government in Iran, which is made of sort of Islamic technocrats in 1979. And so in theory, right, that was a constitutional government. There could have been, it looked like in 1979, potentially a democratic, constitutional, pluralistic, perhaps even regime inside Iran. But the Soviets counseled the Tudeh, the communists, to support Khomeini as the most consistently anti-American force, with the fear that, right, those other elements, right, the middle classes and the military might ultimately, conspire with the Americans to overthrow the revolutionary regime. So in other words, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has proven to be very politically durable, turns out to be, right, a product of this kind of political experimentation. So we've talked about the changing economic models, changing political models. Let's talk about changing narrative models. So just one strain of this is about religion, particularly Islam. So Tan Malaka is one of the Indonesian delegates to the commentary, Fourth Congress Conference 1922. And Tan Malaka, there's a debate about pan-Islamism. Lenin is against allying with pan-Islamism. And Tan Malaka makes the argument that pan-Islamism is a representation, right, that means the brotherhood of all Muslim peoples and the liberation struggle not only of the Arab, but also Indian, Javanese, and the oppressed Muslim peoples. Right? He argues that pan-Islamism is part of the liberation struggle in much of the colonial world. Lenin and the others are not willing to hear this, and pan-Islamism is still condemned by the Comintern in 1922. Sukarno, as we talked about, president of Indonesia, he also argues that Islam is a religion of the masses. Essentially, that there are two kinds of religions, the way Lenin talks about two kinds of nationalism, right? There's the nationalism of the oppressors, the nationalism of the oppressed. Sukarno talks about religions of the oppressors and religion of the oppressed. But the problem is, right, there's this intrinsic opposition to considering religion as a force for liberation, considering that Marxism sees religion as the opiate of the masses, right? Religion in Marxism is seen as something that preserves the existing social order, right? It's designed to create political quietism. And so it took a long time for the Soviets to see that opposing religion in the developing world in this way not only, right, would lose support, would make them seem like, again, repeating the mistakes of the colonialists who were also seen as oppressive local religions, but it would potentially alienate an ally, right, in the struggle for liberation, right, as the Soviets saw it. And so in the post-mortem after the Indonesian coup, one of the things the Soviet ambassador writes to Gromyko, the foreign minister, he writes in his sort of post-mortem, there had not been sufficient value given to the purely religious Muslim factor of the country. Keep in mind the absolute majority of the people are deep believers. So it's ironic because, again, if you read the entire book, you'll see that the Soviets in the course of 62, 63, 64 actually counseled the leaders of the Indonesian Communist Party against, right, being tolerant of Islamic beliefs. So essentially, the Soviets are blaming the Indonesians for a mistake that the Soviets themselves forced upon the Indonesian Communist Party, right? That's not terribly uncharacteristic. But the point is, at least, they recognize that it is a mistake, even if it was really their mistake as opposed to, the PKI's mistake, the Indonesian Communist Party's mistake. But they're now reevaluating the role of religion, right? Maybe we should incorporate religion into our, revolutionary coalition as opposed to seeking to alienate it. And so along comes the Iranian Revolution, and this is explicitly pitched as combining religion and essentially liberation, right? And liberation not just in a colonial sense, but economic sense. Really the argument, as I described in the book, of a lot of the ideologues of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 is that Islam can succeed where socialism failed. That socialism sought to be an anti-colonial, anti-imperial ideology, which would both shake off the imperial yoke, reestablish, political dignity and independence, and bring economic egalitarianism. And socialism failed to achieve those things. Islam can achieve those things where socialism failed to do, right? So it's essentially a replacement for the role that socialism sought to play in the post-colonial era. And you can see this in the opening of Radio Tehran, name of Almighty God, crusher of tyrants, shaming the oppressed. We desire to be gracious to those who have been oppressed on earth, to make them leaders, make them inheritors. Right? This is the voice of right, the voice of the oppressed, the voice of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in the beginning, right, they take this seriously. So this is an East German Foreign Ministry report. Most of my sources on Iran and the Iran chapter are taken from East German sources. Many of them reflect Soviet conversations, but the Soviet sources themselves were still closed at this point. But you can see that they think there's possibility for Khomeini playing a progressive role, right? That it's up to the clergy, this is sort of an amazing sentence, the need grows for the clergy to develop ideas to further socioeconomic development of the country. Imagine Marxists saying that Islamic clergy should be the ones to develop progressive socioeconomic ideas, that will be the source of progressive socioeconomic ideas. And the first president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who actually did a degree in economics at the Sorbonne, was described as a Iranian Franco-Maoist, wrote a book called Iqtisad-e-Tawhid, which means the monotheistic economy, arguing that monotheism gives a guide to economic egalitarianism that neither socialism nor capitalism could fulfill. So here's a sort of interactive slide. When we talk about the transformation of these narratives, I wanted to see these two quotes. Take a look at them. One of them is from a leading Soviet ideologue, and one of them is from Ayatollah Khomeini. See if you can tell which one is which, right? It should be obvious, right? One is the kind of 20th century theocrat par excellence, and one is an atheist. Anybody want to guess which one is which? This one's Khomeini? Why do you say this is Khomeini? Right, one would think, right? There's a lot of moralism in there. Vulgar, ideologically empty literature, gangsters, chorus girls, praise of adultery. And this one's talking about technology, the conquest of space, right? That one's Khomeini and that one's Andrei Zhdanov. That one's Stalin's chief ideologist. So, right, it's kind of amazing to think about, in theory, these should be, you could not imagine more opposite people ideologically, and yet they begin to converge in what they're talking about. So this is the mobilization of certain kinds of narratives as justification of revolution. So I want to talk about where these things end up at the end of the Cold War. So as I said, right, economically, there's a shift from Stalinist industrialization to Leninist political organization. And this is an inversion of the Marx relationship between politics and economics, right? Instead of the economics being primary and shaping the politics, you control the politics and the economics will follow. And this has been very faithful for most of Southern Africa. So pretty much every country in Africa, almost, south of the DRC, south of the Congo, remains a single-party Leninist regime. Decades after CPSU has lost power, decades of the supposed end of the Cold War. But, right, Nyerere's party is still in power in Tanzania. It changed its name in 1977, but it's still the same party, right? Has not lost elections since independence. Frelimo is still in power in Mozambique. The MPLA is still in power in Angola, right? ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, SWAPO in Namibia, the ANC in South Africa, right? These are all parties structured as Leninist political institutions, right, which still maintain single-party rule. And so despite the fact, right, they have all different sorts of, economic quirks. So that model, right, of maintaining political control with economic flexibility has endured 3 decades beyond the Cold War in Southern Africa, for example. And you can find examples of this elsewhere in the world, but it's just really striking in Southern Africa because it's almost every state in the region, all of which, right, fought liberation struggles. And that's part of why, right, their parties were formed in this way, because they fought liberation struggles as the parties were dependent upon Soviet or Chinese aid. And this justification still exists. So this is an interview with a senior MPLA cadre in Angola in the mid-2000s. This is long after the end of the Cold War. This is after the end of the first stage of the civil war in Angola. This country needs to develop the cosmopolitan elites it never had, which presupposes allowing them access to wealth and power. It may not please you to hear it, but Angola needs rich, strong, and powerful families that can stand up to international competition to have a republic of better-fed poor people. All with the third grade is not a viable model for us. This is a member of a party that used to declare itself Marxist-Leninist. This is somebody who fought as a guerrilla, right, in a Marxist organization with the Soviets and the Cubans during the Civil War. He's saying that to have a republic of better-fed poor people, all with the third grade, is not a viable model for us. And so what you have in these countries is you have a political elite that is also an economic elite, right? In Angola, the entire economy is basically the oil firm Sonangol, which is run by MPLA officials. And the justification is that, right, the only way to have an anti-imperialist government is to have economic control in the hands of people who are politically and ideologically loyal. And not to disperse resources, to have a better-fed poor people, all with the third grade. And so another transformation is incorporating Marx's tools of socialism, rejection of central planning, right? So this is one of the key transformations that they decide central planning is not how you do socialism, but it's not the only way to do socialism, right? Socialism does not have to involve state control of the means of production. It just has to involve social control of the means of production. So if you can find ways for society to control the means of production without the state having to own it, that can be beneficial. And so this, again, this remains, I'll talk later, I have a project on understanding socialism in China today, but you can see echoes of this elsewhere. So this is Wen Jiabao, the Chinese prime minister in 2009, talking about Adam Smith, talking about the fruits of society's economic development cannot be shaped by all that is morally unsound and risky. So there is socialist capitalism and non-socialist capitalism, right, according to Wen Jiabao. In Ayatollah Khamenei's version, there's halal capitalism and non-halal capitalism, right? If some people have capital and they use it to help the country develop, and of course they make some profit, that act is good and profit made is halal, right? So there are ways of incorporating markets that fit with our broader values, and there are ways that don't. And this is true even in the United States. So Michael Harrington, one of the founders of the DSA. So this is Michael Harrington from 1989. I would argue probably the most is that still there? Yeah, okay. The most influential, okay, my monitor just went out. The most influential socialist in late 20th century America says, the aim then is a socialism that makes markets a tool of non-market purposes. And it is not totally utopian for the new socialists to argue that in liberating themselves from the capitalist context frustrates their virtues, the visible hand can use the invisible hand for its own purposes. And finally, right, the adoption of other sources of legitimacy. This is where the narrative comes in, right? If class-based narratives don't provide you legitimacy, don't give you traction in the population, then you focus on other narratives based around nationalism, ethnicity, race, religion, as opposed to class. And so again, you end up with, this is another article from a Tanzanian newspaper in 1968. There's nothing modern about miniskirts, right? It's not just the Islamic Republic of Iran that enforces sort of Islamic moral standards. It turns out that Soviet-backed progressives around the developing world, right, start embracing what we would consider to be sort of traditional cultures as an anti-Western measure. And the Soviets, right, that's where this whole Zhdanov thing about chorus girls comes in, right? This becomes policy, right, as part of, anti-Western narratives. Okay, so what do I see? I was asked this question about directions for future research. And I think I've gone a little bit over, so I'm going to go relatively quickly on this. So there have been a couple of major surveys that I would argue sort of distinguish between the idea of a long Cold War, a Cold War based on structural transformations of the world economy from the late 19th century to today, versus the short Cold War, right, the period between 1945 and 1989 of sort of geopolitical confrontation. I think most likely in terms of future research that Radchenko's work is going to be difficult to surpass because he had access to Soviet and Chinese documents that will be hard for anyone to see in the near future. So it makes more sense for historians to focus on areas of the former, i.e. structural socioeconomic forces that have not been, I think, given their adequate treatment. One is the evolution of social political economy in the Soviet periphery and empire. Empire, of course, for many of us who are not willing to step foot in Russia now, but go to the Baltics or go to Ukraine or go elsewhere. Re-evaluation of continuities across 89-91 divide, attention to the West, the left and the West. So this is one of my current projects, which I think has really been neglected. There is new work on globalization and the collapse of the Soviet bloc, Fritz Bartel's book, Michael de Groot's book, Evolution of the Late Soviet Economy and Reform Attempts, Yakov Fagin, Chris Miller, Vlad Zubak's book on Gorbachev and others. And I think the long run question might be to reinterpret what the end of the Cold War actually meant historically. I think it turns out the significance of 1991, looking back in retrospect, is different than what people thought about it for a long time afterwards. And so in terms of my own current project, so the history of the Western New Left in global context I'm working on. So I've written a chapter right now so far on 1956, which will be coming out in International History Review soon. This is, with apologies to Professor Kotkin, this is really the third volume of my dissertation, as I originally proposed it in 2006. I'm working on a broader history of the idea of revolution from the 17th century to the present. So this is a long-term project which is supposed to be based on secondary sources. And the idea is essentially to look at 9 different revolutions, beginning with the English Revolution in the 17th century, and asking for each revolution the following 4 questions. Who made the revolution? Against whom did they make the revolution? What was their critique of the existing society? And what society did they want to replace it with? And then look at how the answers to those 4 questions change from revolution to revolution over time. And the shorter project, as I said, is I have a project right now to figure out what the Chinese Communist Party today means by socialism, which is a lot of Xi Jinping thought. I can give you some of my preliminary findings on that. But with that, I think I'm over. I want to open up for questions.
We have 2 microphones here. Go ahead and
Yeah, thank you so much. I was just wondering how the tension between democracy and dictatorship fits within your canvas of larger transformations of socialism in the 20th century, and perhaps where you'd place Xi, where you'd place Gorbachev, other.
Where I place Xi?
Xi
Jinping.
Yeah.
In terms of dictatorship and.
Yeah, I mean, just how you think about this tension within this bigger project.
Within my project or?
Within your
Socialist project.
Yes, within your second book.
So as I said, I think that there is, there's essentially a dalliance with democracy. The idea that, democracy is a potential road to socialism in probably the mid-1960s to mid-1970s. And I think there's, part of that, as I say, is the Chilean coup is a very important moment. I think the Eurocommunism and the dissatisfaction with the route, particularly the Italian communists are taking. But I think there's also a reality that, there's several things that contribute to this, which is why I'm writing this book on the Western left. So I think that the Soviets gradually lose influence in the Western left, which leads them to sort of write off a lot of the Western world by the 1960s, 1970s. And that's where it seems that democracy is really needed as a path forward. And we can go into detail about what I write in this paper on 56, but essentially the story there is that many communist parties take de-Stalinization as an opportunity for introducing reformist programs. And there's sort of reformist factions versus Stalinist factions. And the Soviets put their finger on the scale and sort of make sure the Stalinists went out. And this particularly devastates the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States. And so by the time the 60s rolled around, the reformists, had they been in power, especially in the United States, would have been looking to build bridges to the student movement, the civil rights movement, and the labor movement and others. The existing communists, the hardcore Stalinists, William Z. Foster and Gus Hall and their followers, failed to do so. And so by the late 1960s, the communists in the US, in France, in Italy and others are sort of marginalized, especially the Soviet allied communists. And so the prospect, right, of any sort of Soviet allied party playing a specific political role by the late 1960s is really unlikely by that point. And so, right, the Italians and the French sort of later kind of follow, right, this Euro-communist path, which is basically, disavowing the Soviets and making a, agreement with the Christian Democrats, right? That's seen as unsatisfactory to Moscow, but there's no real democratic path that's still viable at that point. So I think the democratic dream, to the degree that it exists, is basically dies in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I don't know if that answers your question.
Change, but yeah, given, right? But sort of the changes that you're describing at the same time are kind of permanent, namely everything you've been talking about 1970s already was discussed in the 1920s. The многоукладная экономика, so they're all the agricultural countries and so on and so forth. So in that sense, like sort of there is no change, right? So they're still within the same set of kind of problems that they're dealing with. So can you tell us a little bit more, like sort of like what the argument is?
Yeah, so I think, right, there is, you look at the Chinese today and they talk about NEP, for example. So they're talking back to the 1920s. And many of the ideas, as you say, right, there was a variety of opinions in the 1920s. It does not mean that those opinions were put into policy. So what I'm arguing is, first of all, I'm making the intervention, as I said, ideologically, that this was a serious ideological debate going on through the entire period. And much of the literature, if not the majority of the literature, does not buy this, right? The existing literature tends to think that the Soviet aid project in the developing world was about influence, allies, and potentially economic benefit, right? So if you read like Oscar Sanchez-Simoni's Red Globalization itself, you'll see the economic benefit argument. And I'm saying that those things are not what this is about, right? It doesn't make any sense to say it's about economic benefit. It's not solely about geopolitical influence or buying allies. And it's not just about, right, trying to essentially implement the Stalinist orthodox model everywhere. That this is an authentic attempt to have a conversation about how we can shape a social model that will fit the developing world, right? They're authentically interested in, not only in feedback, but in trying to figure out how we make this work. That by itself is an intervention. That's intervention number one.
Well, yeah, but it sort of reminds me sort of the discovery that Kotkin made when he read Stalin's archive and discovered that actually he was Bolshevik.
Yes.
What else do you expect to find there?
Well, so again, if you read Red Globalization, what you'll find is, and it's not just that book. I've read many, other books and articles, including many that I've refereed, that will say things like, this was only about, trying to get foreign currency. This was only about, trying to buy loyalties of different political leaders. And so you might think this sounds obvious, but I can tell you the way the literature sees it in the opposite way. Right, precisely for the same reason that Kotkin had to make the intervention about the domestic politics, is because people didn't want to believe that was the case. And I think, this ties with the broader project of history of socialism, because the broader point here, right, is that if you're going to tell a history of socialism, you have to integrate the communists, the Marx-Leninists, into that history of socialism, right? So people in the West who want to say, right, let's talk about socialism, we don't want to isolate it from the Soviet Union or from Cuba or from China or from wherever else, right? That is, those were some power-hungry people or whatever who were trying to develop, a primitive economy, based on histories of, Chinese imperial history or Russian imperial history, right? That's not relevant to what we're doing here, right? Our version of socialism. My argument is that, yes, it is, right? This is part of the global socialist conversation in which, even as I will get to in the third book, right, even Western people on the Western left are actually in conversation with both second world and third world socialists. So that you can't tell the history of socialism including in the West, without the history of the Soviet Union and the history. And like one of the things I will do in this book is I think, for example, the impact of the collapse of Soviet communism on the Western left has not yet really been written about, and I think it was a lot more significant, right? So if you read this historiography now, it'll say like, people in the West stopped caring about the Soviet Union at some point in the 1950s or 1960s. On the ground, that's not true, right? Nor is it a fact that, when China decides to modernize or when China decides to reform its economy in the late 1970s, that people write China off as a capitalist country. That's not true either. So I think, it might seem obvious, but it's not the state of the literature. Yeah.
I'm going to intervene with a question here. Thank you for this really fascinating talk. And I like, you created establishing the models and the narratological things. There was a sort of mechanism of change, which was failure, that you laid out. But I wondered if you're open to the idea that the mechanism of change is not necessarily failure, but there might be other factors or forces or interinstitutional dynamics, let's say within, because a lot of the examples that you give of postmortems on these failures come from various sort of institutional kitchens inside Soviet foreign policy creation. So could you unpack, open the hood a little bit on the variety of institutions that are trying to establish Soviet policy so that we don't think it's some homogenous sort of singular trajectory?
Yeah, so as I think you were getting to, right, there are many, I thought you were going to ask about, are there examples of success, and you learn from success as well. But I think, in terms of institutions, that sort of takes me down a different path, which is the financial one, right? And so there's clearly, right, there are, multiple institutions that are involved here. I was thinking about writing an article about sort of how an aid project gets built in the Soviet Union and sort of all the steps, because I've read so many different, evaluations of dam projects in Indonesia and such, from every different Soviet institution. And so that, right, there's the foreign ministry, which is usually not involved in the third world very much under Gromyko, but sometimes shows up. There's the KGB, which is heavily involved, but often sort of, at least in the archival record that I can see, right, tends to be an advisory capacity. I don't see a lot of, the KGB archive itself is still closed. The international department, which is where most of sort of the action seems to be when it comes to developing countries, especially when they're liberation movements, they're not yet states, so they don't have relations with the foreign ministry. Even though it's a very small shop, but the international department, which is a department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, is essentially taken over the successor role to the Comintern. The Comintern kind of becomes internalized, common form, then becomes internalized after the late 1950s. And they're sort of a clearinghouse of information. So the academic institutes are feeding information into the international department, which is then producing policies, and usually, especially by the late 1970s, right, Ponomaryov was heading the national department, is meeting with people like Andropov before they go into the Politburo. They're presenting kind of united front to Brezhnev. There's the State Committee on Foreign Economic Ties, right, whose job is essentially administering the aid programs. But from what I can tell, they're in charge of feasibility and such, but they're often downstream from the political decisions that are coming from the national department. There's a lot of other kind of, then they're the ones who connect with a lot of the other ministries. So if it's a dam that's, there's the Ministry of Water Transport and things like that. If it's a metallurgical factory, there's a Ministry of Geology and Heavy Metals and things like that, right? So I'd say those are some of the main institutions, right? Of course, the Ministry of Defense is involved at some point, but that's also another very big archive that can't really see. So I think financial considerations certainly matter as one thing. And obviously you can see the evolution, right? It looks like it goes from more Soviet spending to less Soviet spending over time, right? That's pretty clear, at least in the economic sense, not in the military sense. And I can't discount that. Again, when I said, I talked in the beginning about ideology and beliefs, interests and capabilities, right? The financial aspect is an element of capabilities and interests. I don't think, if you look at, of course, the size of the Soviet economy, these aid numbers are still pretty small, even at the end, right, as a percentage of the whole. So it's not the kind of thing that this, sunk the Soviet economy, some story like that. But it certainly was, a happy coincidence, right, that over time that, especially like if you can't prove this is going to work, right, then obviously if it's also expensive, that gives us an extra motivation, right? It gives other parties in the discussion more ammunition to invoke different policies. So clearly the financial motivation is there. Are there other motivations? If you want to get sort of really sort of kind of theological about it, right? There are discussions inside, Soviet, academic institutes about the role of religion, the role of race, things like that, even the role of gender, which change over time. I have in my Iran chapter, I have a whole, I chart the kind of academic process of the shifting evaluation of religion in there. So that, but that is coming largely from the academic institutes, which are about generations of scholars and younger scholars challenging older scholars and things like that. So there's an element of that. As far as success, I think the biggest question of success, right? That I think, to a certain degree, this whole story is built on success, right? To a certain degree, like the appeal of the Soviet model in the first place, the 1960s, is built on the idea that Soviets were succeeding economically, right? They had caught up to the United States, or at least come close, right, in a very short amount of time without foreign intervention. And then, of course, you have the Soviet space program and Sputnik, whatever. And that's part of what that's part of what sells developing countries on the idea that this is something we should be trying to do. So it begins with an element of success, and then the element of success at the end, which I think is another area. This is not Soviet history, why I didn't put it on there, but I think that still hasn't really been treated yet. Is of course the Chinese reforms, and when countries in the developing world see that as success and recognize it for what it is. I think Chun Jian and I have discussed this, and he thinks that it's a much earlier process than I think it was. I'm not convinced that people saw it as like the China was a success by the early 1980s yet, right? I think it took longer than that. But by the mid to late 1980s, you have at least Vietnam following a Chinese path, and so that's a story of like when do countries begin seeing China as a viable version of socialism and something to copy from that point on? It certainly is the case that by the late 1980s, Doi Moi in Vietnam and others, that China is now a model, right? And it's also copied to a degree in Mozambique, in Angola. So that's a second sort of model of success. So I think, yes, my story is mostly a narrative of failures, but there are other elements, I think, and two of those obviously are finance and success. And then there's the question, of course, what the United States is doing, which is an entire, right, another variable here.
Hello. Because you highlight the role of ideology, I wanted to ask about that. So, like, quote from Zhdanov, that is very characteristic. And I've read a lot of similar stuff. And ideologically, it's examples of, I would say, extreme stupidity. And that ruled the day despite all the economic successes. So then the people who came after Stalin and Zhdanov and Beria, they sort of retained something ideological, but something's changed. But still, they had failure after failure, like you explained, and nothing basically enlightened them to revisit something fundamental about their ideology. So when you said it was a prison, yes, something like that. But what would they have to change to get out of that prison? And I'm sure you remember they also talked about like Praxis as test bed of theory or something. I don't know how to translate exactly, but you know what I'm talking about. So they failure after failure. What prevented them from realizing that some deep conflict or problem is within their ideology?
Okay, so first, I think I said ideology is a prism, not a prison. I didn't mean to say.
Okay, yeah. Okay, good. That works as well.
Yeah. So I think your question, if I understand it correctly, is you're saying essentially what would have convinced the Soviet leadership to drop Marx-Leninist ideology?
Or parts of it, not all of it, because it's fundamentally very hard to understand, for me at least. If you have an ideology, it seems flexible. So you can take this part and remove that part, but that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened, regardless of whatever failures they had trying to sell their socialist project in the world. So what prevented them? I cannot explain that economically, because like if we go with orthodox Marxism, I'm supposed to say that it's all economics, and then the ideology is driven by that. But I don't see that in Brezhnev's times. So, but your position is that it's a prism. So within that prism, okay, sorry. What idea do you have to retain or throw out to be able to succeed practically in the world, to sell and build socialism in another country?
Okay, so now I'm seeing different questions. The question is, what element of socialist ideology is it that creates the failure?
Yeah.
So I mean, look. So I think there's multiple ways of answering this. I think people have said to me before, well, I teach at a business school, so when I start talking about socialism, people think, well, that's something from the past, right? Nobody cares about socialism anymore. That was defeated a long time ago. And I mean, this is at HBS. And the first thing I tell them is that, to me, socialism is kind of like Christianity in a certain sense. That there have been many Christian preachers who've said Jesus is going to come back on so and such day, and Jesus didn't come back, and they didn't give up the next day, right? You don't abandon, right, your ideology because the prediction you made didn't work out, right? You have a story then about why it didn't happen and who's preventing it, right? So class. I mean, I think the key element that's sort of underlying this, right, is the idea of class struggle, right? And as long as you have class struggle, you have the idea that there are enemies, and those enemies are powerful, and they're trying to stop you from what you're doing. And so you have an explanation for failure, right? The explanation for failure is that the class enemies are responsible for the failure. And so that explanation is always available. And so as long as you maintain faith, and of course, there's, I don't think this is what we're getting at, but like, obviously, the power structure is built upon belief in a certain ideology. And so if you abandon the ideology, this is very much, in terms of how the Chinese today understand the Soviet collapse, is the Soviets lost faith in their ideology. That's what the Chinese will say, and that's why the Soviet Union collapsed. And so we have to maintain faith in the ideology. It's the only thing that keeps the party in power. So there's an element of perhaps of legitimation, but their critique of Gorbachev was precisely that he was willing to actually sort of question the fundamentals of socialism in a way that no social leader ever should if they wanted to maintain the party. So I think there's an element of, right, this is the system, this is how it works, and we can't really question it. But I think there's a built-in mechanism for explaining failure that allows you to have an easier path than abandoning the ideology. And so I think, again, this is true of Christianity, this is true of, religious beliefs, for example, that, even if things seem to falsify your beliefs, there are built-in explanations that explain that falsification that allow you to continue, especially if, giving up the belief has major consequences, such as losing power, for example. I don't know if that answers your question.
In a sense, weren't they right that it was class struggle like in Chile or Tanzania in Africa? So in a sense, like in Chile, it's well known, the American capitalism involvement and the whole Chicago boys, etc., etc., etc. So in a sense, we can argue that they were right. But they still failed to produce the viable program. They basically separated their position, as far as I understood you. They failed to unite the forces that were supposed to be united in class struggle, etc., etc. So I think rejecting class struggle wouldn't have helped them at all, because that's obviously what were at the time playing out.
So I think this is interesting because you said in a sense they were right. I think that phrase in a sense, to my mind, is doing a lot of work, because that's, in a sense, right there, that's the prism of ideology as I see it. I think you can explain developments in these countries without reference to class struggle. I think you can explain them with reference to class struggle, but that's one way of interpreting events. I'm not convinced, right? I think yes, you're absolutely right that you can say this was class struggle that defeated Allende, or that so on, or that defeated Sukarno, or whatever. But I'm not sure that that's the only explanation, or that has to be the explanation. But that is the explanation you would give if you said this is why we have to continue with our ideology.
Can I? It's on? Okay, sorry. Thank you. This is really interesting. So maybe I'm just continuing the same conversation, same question that Sergey and Michael have asked. We have a colleague in the department who is writing a history of global Marxism, and for the early period. And interestingly, it doesn't really, not even overlap. It doesn't even somehow intersect somehow with your project of global socialism. And I think that the main reason is that the model that you describe, all of these constituent parts, they all about economy. And there is something about like peaceful coexistence, geopolitical, but it's a, again, economic coexistence. So you present socialism essentially which probably was, right? It's from the beginning an economic, political economic project. Whereas Marxism, as Ed Baring, my colleague, describes, is more about working class, education, cultural hegemony, and all things that are ideological. Whereas here we are dealing with ideology which is very much oriented toward practice. So I don't know, my question would be, if you bring in this Marxist cultural political perspective, would you see more variation? As you mentioned religion, of course, this is because it's such a big difference between all of the countries that you described. But so there is this more of this Marxist cultural perspective. What would change? And maybe you can say a few words why this global Marxism story and global socialism story are so diverging, if they are.
So I think, I mean, I'd be interested in seeing more of this project and figuring out actually how much it diverges. I think there are a couple of answers which are going to be unsatisfactory, right? One is that, this is summarizing 2 books and more in 55 minutes or whatever, and there's a lot more inside the book that I think would fit with what you're talking about. Again, I get into a lot more detail in the Iran chapter about religion and I didn't talk about race at all here. I talk about race a lot in the book, for example. So I think that's one probably unsatisfactory answer. A second probably unsatisfactory answer is that I think a lot of this has to do with dealing with states versus movements, individuals, and so on and so forth. That there, when you're running a state, the question is, right, how do you gain political loyalty, right? How do you gain political support? How do you gain allies? And so, I mean, the economic aid program is an easier way to do this, right, or sort of a concrete way to do this. And so I think, there's a question of like, how come communists keep changing when they come into power, right? Their priorities seem to change when they come into power. It's because there are choices you have to make when you come into power that are different than when you are making a revolution. And so I think a lot of what you're talking about will come out a lot more, hopefully, in the 3rd book on the New Left, in which the communists don't actually come to power. And I think, but I think there's, the communists who are not in power, the socialists who are not in power, the leftists who are not in power, are learning from those who are. And so that's where I think the influence will come. I think it still does to a certain degree, but I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. I'd have to know more about exactly what that project looks like and how it diverges.
I think that the main difference here is that the ideology can be product of the state or product of intellectuals. So your ideology is product of people who are part of bureaucracy in the state apparatus, whereas Marxists from Baring's book are people who are intellectuals in the true sense. So they are not restricted. They create fantasies of this ideal world. I'm just thinking about why is there such a difference?
Exactly, and no, exactly, and I think that's the distinction between Marxists who are in power versus those who are not in power, right? So I think one of the interventions, or the methodological interventions of my work, is to treat policymakers as intellectuals, right? That diplomats is one thing, right? But I don't know what you call members of the International Department, for example, or members of the Solidarity Committee or the Peace Committee, and so on and so forth, right? Who are also maybe especially Institute of Africa or Institute of the Peoples of Asia and such. But they're deploying ideas, but in the name of the state. And so that means that you ultimately want to promote policies that are going to get implemented by the Politburo that the state has the capability of doing, right? It's not about necessarily changing consciousness, because yes, you can have an educational policy in the Soviet Union. It's harder to have kind of change hearts and minds, let's say in Angola, right, or in Indonesia. Indonesian communists can do that, but it's hard for you from Moscow to change minds in Angola, right? So that's a much more difficult process. So I think, right, so that by itself, like once you're in this position, you have to, and of course, if you're, writing for the International Department, writing for, let's say, Ponomaryov, you don't get to write a 500-page book, right? You get to write a 2-page memo. And so there's a lot less you can say in the 2-page memo than the 500-page book, right? It's just kind of the mechanics of power. And so it's simpler to talk about an aid project than to talk about changing hearts and minds. So I think a lot of this, right, is that, and it plays out in terms of when you think about the reception of Marx himself, right, on people on the left in the 1960s, right? It's always amazing to me, right? You read about, people are obsessed in the late 1960s with, the early Marx manuscripts, right, early 1840s. And then, so they think that the Soviets are getting Marx wrong, because like we're reading 1840s Marx. And of course, who are the Soviets quoting? They're quoting Marx the 1860s and 1870s, right? Marx, the political actor, Marx who's, running the first Working Men's International, Marx who's advising socialist parties, and so the Marx that Lenin quotes is the Marx of the political actor and administrator. The Marx that people are quoting in Berkeley or in Ann Arbor in Paris in 1968 is the Marx of the notebooks of the 1840s, and you can see sort of the dichotomy within Karl Marx himself of being sort of the student philosopher and being kind of an administrative revolutionary.
Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is more kind of methodological, and I didn't read the book. I only read your first book, so I will be kind of here orienting myself on your talk. And the question is basically that if you're talking about multiple kind of political developments across the third world, but the common kind of uniting thread throughout the talk is the Soviet role there, right? And we learn about some of these events through kind of the voice and through the sources of Soviet ministries. And my question would be, with this kind of a methodology, is there no kind of inherent danger in overestimating the Soviet role as a driving force in some of these developments? For instance, just a few examples from the talk, like on Indonesia, you said that kind of within the Communist Party of Indonesia, there were discussions as for whether to be on board with Sukarno's guided democracy project, and it was probably Soviet kind of advice which pushed Indonesian communists to make this choice. But how can we really know this, right? Given that first, an argument can be made that the choice was overdetermined because from the beginning, the military wasn't really sympathetic to the communists and the conservative political parties either. So a case can be made that had they opposed Sukarno's move, it would have been suicidal for the party then. And of course, afterwards, there was a kind of genocidal violence towards the party once the Sukarno's regime fell. But even if there was a genuine choice, how do we know it was the Soviet advice which pushed Indonesian communists as opposed to other advice or internal deliberations? Or kind of another example would be with Iran. I think you had this quote that kind of the ultimate arrangement in Iran was the result of this kind of changing I had a quote of basically, Soviet experimentation, but then an argument can be made that socio-political arrangement in Iran in the aftermath of the revolution had much more to do with domestic Iranian factors. And same kind of with the regimes in Southern Africa. It's true that there is a kind of institutional legacy with one party, or in the case of South Africa, not really one party, but kind of one party-dominated political system, and the Soviet example, but then there are also Soviet-supported one-party regimes which are not there anymore, and there are non-socialist and non-Soviet-inspired authoritarian regimes kind of across the third world. So yeah, basically the question would be, with Soviet sources being so prominent in your research, how to avoid the danger of seeing Soviet Union as the main kind of driving factor in all this context across the world?
Yeah, so I think there are several answers to that, and I would want to go through some of the individual cases. So first, yes, I mean, I certainly presented Soviet sources being very central, and they are very central to my work because they're the ones that were easiest to access in the quantity that I needed. They were not the only ones that I accessed. And so in the book, I get into a lot of, sources that I think would speak, but, in certain cases, like Indonesian Communist Party archives are not available right now. The MPLA archives are not available. But that doesn't mean that, as you say, that the Soviets are the explanation for everything. And I think I did not, I think I may have, perhaps given the impression, right, that I think, that the Soviets were determinative in these instances. It was not so they're determinative. So I didn't mean to say that, for example, the Tudeh party followed the policy it did because the Soviets told them to. I don't think I said it in those terms. I didn't intend to. The point was that they advised them to, and there was an alternative, right? So there was, right, the other major parties on the left, the Fedayeen, the Mujahideen, right, actually opposed, Khomeini early on. I mean, the Mujahideen basically fight a civil war against Khomeini. They rallied in defense of the constitution in the summer of '79, and the Tudeh actually opposed them. And then later on, the Tudeh will actually go to Khomeini and sort of help them. When they're fighting the Mujahideen, the Tudeh actually helps Khomeini sort of locate the Mujahideen and kill them. And as I write in my chapter, the Tudeh actually remains sort of supportive of Khomeini and his economic policies beyond the point at which the Soviets and East Germans have lost faith in them. So it's not that the Soviets are telling the Tudeh this is what you have to do. It's that they are advising them along these lines, but they also help, pick a Tudeh leader who will support Khomeini. So there's a conference within the Tudeh party where they replaced Secretary General in January of '79 with someone who is more in line with Soviet thinking, which again does not mean the Soviets determined their thinking. So I did not mean to give the impression that it was this was an order. You do this and they followed. That was if I gave that impression that was a mistake. That was not the impression I meant to give. In the case of Indonesia, for example. So again, if you look at the book, you'll see that there were prominent members of the Indonesian Communist Party saying that we should maintain democracy, we should not support Sukarno, and then the General Secretary goes to Moscow, comes back, and changes his mind. So again, it's not definitive proof. It seems right, and the Soviets were talking very positively about the idea of guided democracy. So it seems like there's a tension between what the Indonesian communist leadership was saying, what the Soviets are saying. He goes to Moscow, comes back. There's no sort of kind of smoking gun there. And I'm not saying that any of this operates in terms of orders, because one of the key elements of that chapter is precisely the way in which the Indonesian Communist Party plays between the Soviets and the Chinese, right? So they move from alliance with Moscow in 60, 61, sort of alliance with Beijing in 63, 64, 65. So they're all independent agents, right? And that fits within this bigger model I'm talking about of this is a conversation, right? It is not about, subordinates following orders. It is not about the imposition of models, right? This is an evolution in which there are gradients of power. So like it is hard if you're the leader of a communist party who depends on Moscow for aid to say no to what they're telling you. It's not impossible, especially if someone in Beijing can step in, right? And sometimes they will reject both. And sometimes they get rejected by both. Allende goes to beg for aid, first in Moscow in December of 72, and then sends his foreign minister to Beijing in February of 73, and they both get turned down, basically. So it's not, I understand your point about, sort of the weight of evidence, which is to a certain degree kind of a regrettable fact of, I think, of research in this area right now. Research in Iran was not really possible. I did a lot of research in Chile, but a lot of the party archives themselves had been destroyed in the coup and the aftermath. So a lot of it was, foreign ministry and such. But I did not mean to give the impression that Moscow was essentially ordering people around here. And that would be contrary to what I'm, like the bigger picture.